Good morning, everybody. I'm Idaho Secretary of State Phil McGrain, and it is my privilege to kick things off today. This is our fourth and final session in terms of transparency and openness in government. This has been a really collaborative partnership, and I think all of us, as we've kind of headed into this final one, have really appreciated the opportunity to be able to speak to so many Idahoans, especially all of you online. I think we have record attendance today in terms of our online participation, so thank you for everyone who's been able to chime in. This has been a partnership, collaborated of Idahoans for Openness in Government, IDOG, but along with our partners, the Idaho Press Club, the Idaho Association of Counties, the Association of Idaho Cities, and myself, Controller Brandon Wolf, former Deputy Attorney General Brian Kane, and of course, our beloved Betsy Russell, who will come up here in just a moment. I can't emphasize enough just how important this topic is as we try to engage citizens in government. All of these topics, whether it's talking about finances, talking about campaign finances, but really our open meetings and public records, this really is your access as the public to the information that is done on your behalf. And so hopefully those of you who have been able to participate in some of the earlier sessions have seen a great benefit in terms of just learning how all of this works. As stewards of the public and just as trustees in our roles, I think it's important for us to always be encouraging government to be open. I know Brandon and I are particularly interested in trying to advocate openness in government. You know, his efforts with Town Hall Idaho are a great example of just anything we can do to add more information and access to the public. So today, Brian will be leading the show. He'll be introduced here in a moment. We'll be fielding questions. But please know that we hope that in this future, the videos that are available will be accessible to everyone in the public so that more and more people can learn how to access their government. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Town Hall himself, Controller Brandon Wolf, to do some of the introductions.
We're getting some feedback in from the question that maybe the sound may not be working, so I'm just kind of giving a shout out to our partners that are helping with the sound and volume. And Idaho Public Television. Thanks to Patrick and his team over there that are helping. Thank you, Secretary McGrain. To help lead our discussion today and make further introductions, I would like to introduce Betsy Russell. Betsy is a retired newspaper reporter who until January 1st, 2023 was the Boise Bureau Chief and State Government and Politics reporter for the Idaho Press. She is the former longtime president of the Idaho Press Club, the former president of the Idaho Capitol Correspondents Association, and is also the president and co-founder of Idahoans for Openness in Government, or IDOG. A graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, she holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Betsy worked for the Idaho Press for nearly 5 years and previously worked for 27 years for the Spokesman Review. And at both the Spokesman Review and the Idaho Press, she wrote the widely read Eye on Boise blog about Idaho politics and government, which she started in 2004. She previously worked 5 years as a reporter and editor for the Idaho Statesman in Boise, and earlier worked as a reporter for several newspapers in California. She is married with 2 grown children and is an avid skier and windsurfer. Betsy truly is the driver and the spearhead behind these educational opportunities. And recently, it was announced that Betsy is this year's City of Club of Boise Stimson Award for Civic Engagement Award winner, and she will receive and be recognized for this award later this week. Please join me in welcoming Betsy Russell.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Phil. I'm a retired newspaper reporter, and one thing that was always very important to me as a reporter was getting access to government information. I needed it to do my job, to report what was going on. But it's also important to everybody out there, including me, citizen Betsy now as a retiree, to have access to the information about what your government is doing. And that's what IDOG is all about. IDOG is a nonprofit coalition for openness in government and is affiliated with the National Freedom of Information Coalition, which is kind of an umbrella organization of coalitions like this in almost every state. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and there's more about us at our website, which is at openidaho.org. Our mission is to foster open government supervised by an informed and engaged citizenry. We believe that we all benefit when the public, the media, and government officials are fully aware of the public's rights to access government information and observe the conduct of the public's business. Our partners in this effort this year include, as you've heard from them, Idaho Secretary of State Phil McGrain, Idaho State Controller Brandon Wolf, the Idaho Association of Counties, the Association of Idaho Cities, the Idaho Press Club, Idaho Public Television, and Attorneys for Civic Education. And through our partnership with Attorneys for Civic Education here in Idaho, attorney participants today can earn continuing legal education credit, and we'll get to that. During our program today, you can submit questions. If you're here in the room, you should have there are cards and pens available. You can write down your question on a card, hold it up, and a volunteer will come and take it from you. And if you are online, you can submit questions by email to idogquestions@gmail.com. More than 90% of our participants today are online, but we also have some here in the room, and we welcome you all. After this session is over, within a couple of days, the full recording will be posted on IDOG's website at openidaho.org. Also, the full PowerPoint slides. And so if there's anyone you know who misses today's session and wants to catch up, you can find it online there. You will also find there the full recordings and the slides from our 3 previous workshops this fall. Just scroll down to past seminars, and you'll find that. You have a few handouts today. There's a program just listing the order of business, a What is IDOG flyer, which gives information about how you can support us if you so choose, and a flyer about all 4 of the sessions that we're holding this fall. Those are also being posted on the website. If you are an attorney looking for continuing legal education credit, please sign up on the sign up at the back of the room, or send to the idogquestions@gmail.com address your name, bar number, and email address, and we will take care of that. We are very fortunate today to be joined by Brian Kane, the former Chief Deputy Idaho Attorney General, who is now the Executive Director of the National Association of Attorneys General. Brian, who is volunteering his time today, holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Idaho in political science and history, and a law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School. He served 4 years in the U.S. Army before enrolling at the U of I. In 2020, he was one of 4 finalists to become Dean of the University of Idaho College of Law. Idahoans around the state have met Brian as he's traveled with former Idaho Attorney General Lawrence Wasden to open government seminars in every region of the state over the past 2 decades, along with IDOG, educating and informing local government officials, members of the news media, and the public about how to comply with Idaho's 2 key open government laws, the Idaho Public Records Act and the Idaho Open Meeting Law. He is the foremost authority in the state on those laws, and I feel very fortunate that we have him here today with us. Brian has authored legislation, constitutional amendments, and numerous legal articles. He's served as legal counsel to the legislature, the Secretary of State, and the State Treasurer's Office, as liaison between the Attorney General and local state and federal governments, and argued before the Idaho Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Brian served with the Attorney General's office for more than 20 years before accepting his current position in September of 2022. He now travels all over the country and the world, but fortunately for us, he and his family still are based in Boise. Before we hear from Brian today, we're going to call on some of our audience members to play parts in an interactive skit about the Idaho Public Records Act. This will help us get in the mood. Portraying the role of Ernest, the rookie reporter, will be Amy Jordan, Public Records Request Coordinator for the Idaho Transportation Department. And playing the role of undertrained, an overly cautious deputy clerk, is Kyle Pfannenstiel, reporter for the Idaho Capital Sun. Actors, please come up and take your places. Come on around. Stage direction. Okay. In this scene, we meet Ernest, a rookie reporter. Ernest, please wave at the audience. There she is. And undertrained, an overly cautious clerk. Undertrained, please wave. Ernest has received a tip that the county road superintendent's property has been assessed at 30% less than a smaller property right next door. It's a heck of a story if it's true. But Ernest is a bit shy and doesn't want to look nosy. She's also afraid that if she reveals why she wants the assessment, she won't get the document that she needs. Undertrained also thinks Ernest is being nosy, and he's afraid that if he makes a mistake, he'll get fired. Action.
Hi. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. How about you?
Well, I'm fine, I guess. I was kind of wondering if maybe you could, get me some, records. I'd like to get a copy of, the county road superintendent's, assessment, and maybe his tax bill, too. Do you think I could get those things?
That's personal. I don't think I can do that. I'd get fired.
I was kind of checking out a rumor, and I was told that these records are, public records.
Well, why would you want to look at someone's tax records?
Time out! Roughing the constituent! You turn those off. What a great performance, right? Let's hear it for our actors. There are two important points here. First, a public record is a public record. It's none of the government's business, whether Ernest wants to use it for wallpaper, print it in the newspaper, or use it to challenge her own tax bill. In fact, undertrained, violated the public records law by asking Ernest why she wanted these records. The statute specifically says that the custodian of a public record shall make no inquiry, quotes, of any person who applies for a public record except to, 1, verify the identity of a person in accordance with the section of Idaho Code that allows you to see records about yourself, or 2, to verify that the record will not be used for purposes of a telephone or mailing list, or 3, to prevent disclosure of certain personal information collected for driver's licenses, very specific, or as otherwise provided by law. The custodian may provide the requester information to help them narrow the scope of the request, or to help them make the request more specific. Also, the person seeking the record may be required to make a written request and to provide their name, a mailing address, and a telephone number. Second, if undertrained gives Ernest the records she asked for, he is following the law. He cannot be fired for that. Property tax assessments and bills are public, under the general theory that citizens can't review the work of public servants if they can't see the work product. There are many other public records that may seem a bit personal, but they are public records and citizens get to see them. Some examples include monthly bills itemizing use of a government credit card. That's taxpayers' money. Contracts with employees and suppliers and service providers, names of employees, lists of people in arrears on their tax bills, and agency check registers. If you are spending public money or managing public agencies, the public has a right to see what's going on. Let's thank our actors again. Take a bow. Quick change of scene. Now we will hear from Brian Kane about the nuts and bolts of the Idaho Public Records Act and how we can all make it work. Brian.
Thank you. I'm Brian Kane. Before we start, as an attorney, I have to offer you all a disclaimer. Number one, this is not legal advice directed at anyone. I also am not speaking on behalf of the National Association of Attorneys General or any office of Attorney General. If you really want a summation, these are just my musings on the state of the law and public records in Idaho and should be kind of quantified as such. So feel free to challenge them as we go through this as necessary. This first slide that you have in front of you is the statement of purpose for the open meetings law. And I have this up here because it actually is directly relevant to the public records law. And the reasoning is that the hallmark of both the public records law and the open meetings law is transparency within government. In fact, you've seen all of the efforts so far through these sessions to be increasing the transparency of government. I think that we could all agree that we're probably at a national and maybe even a little bit of a state and local moment of a question of the confidence that we have in our government and our government systems. I don't feel like that's that controversial of a statement, but I'm also willing to be wrong or rethink that statement. The reason why it's significant is because oftentimes when folks are questioning what we do, whether we're in government or even in our own home or whatever it is, our response is rarely to say, hey, we need to get more information out there. That will clear this whole thing up. A lot of times what we want to do is we want to retreat behind a closed door or have a closed session and say, hey, we got to figure out how to deal with this. It's a very natural response. The problem with that response is that when we close ranks and we close folks out and don't embrace transparency, how do the blanks get filled in that are left by the closure of those doors and discussions? And I will give you a quick example. I am the proud father of 2 teenagers. Teenagers, they march to their own beat. No matter how well you raise them, no matter how many times you take them to church, they still kind of do their own thing, and they've got a little bit of a rebellious nature to them at times, which we both question and celebrate as good parents. So I, as a mindful, caring father, give them a curfew. And if I say, hey, I want you to be home from ice cream at Goodies by 11 p.m., they say, sure thing, Dad, no problem. Thanks for the car keys. I'll be safe and return it full of gas because they're dutiful, good kids. Well, it gets to be about 11:05, and they're not home. At 11:05 is my first thought that my teenagers are just being teenagers. They're wrapped up having fun with their friends, and they lost track of time? Or is my thought, oh my goodness, they hit a deer, they have a flat tire, whatever, right? There's a whole parade of horribles that marches through our parental minds in that circumstances because we lack information. The same phenomenon occurs with government. When we lack in information, we're going to fill in the blanks with either negative inferences or an assumption, whether right or wrong, that government is up to no good. That's the transactional element of open government and our choice whether to open or close government. And I think that's something that as we go through these laws, we have to kind of keep in mind. Idaho's laws, both under the open meeting law and the public records law, are designed for narrow exceptions. Meaning, if you remember our last session on the open meetings law, every time we went through an exception where you could go into executive session, it was a very specific element that allowed you to go into that executive session. The same analysis applies to the exceptions under the public records law. And if you look under the public records law, there's always something that we could probably, after a little bit of debate, come together around a table and say, you know what, that information really does need to be protected. I mean, one of the best examples that I can offer up to you is the public records law protects Social Security numbers, our individual Social Security numbers. I think we can all come together and say, you know what, if government has my Social Security number, I'm not sure I want that to be shared with someone, right? And then you step back from it and you think, what is the global purpose of the public records law? And the global purpose of the public records law is for us to have oversight of what government is doing. It allows us to look over the shoulder of government as they transact business, right? It's part of our informed citizenry and the republic if we can keep it. Those all kind of mesh together under these elements. And so when you think about it in terms of that Social Security number, the question is that Social Security number a record that identifies how government transacts business? And I think we could generally agree, no, that probably doesn't, right? Now, if we step back and we think, oh, here are the meeting minutes for the last 10 meetings of the city council, well, to me, that becomes direct evidence of how government transacts business. And so you can see, yes, that should be a public record. That allows us to peer over the shoulder of government as they transact business. Does that make sense? Still with me? Awesome. All right. I want to let you know that we are going into the legislative world a little bit. And in the legislative world, they get to create definitions. And so if the definition is something that we don't necessarily agree with, or it isn't the same as what's in Webster's dictionary or on Wikipedia or whatever your source of choice is, the legislature's definition controls. So if the legislature comes out and says, if it has feathers, a bill, quacks, and is water resistant and waddles around, it's a dog, well, then that is a dog for our purposes under this statute, even though we may have a different assumption of what that is. And so I just want to put that out there that at times folks can get really tripped up on these definitions because of that distinction. There are a few key definitions. One of the primary definitions under the Idaho Public Records Law is the custodian. The custodian is essentially the official keeper of the records. That's who you direct any request for public records to, is you make it to the custodian of the records. The law requires that a governmental entity identify who the custodian of those records are or is. And so one of the things to be aware of is if you feel like you're not getting a straight answer from a government, you can ask them, who's the custodian of records? Who do I need to direct this to? They have to disclose that. One of the areas where you may run into trouble is if they aren't actually the keeper of the records. Like say you want county records, but you go to the city, right? At that point, they may not know the answer to that. And so that's one of the things to always keep in mind. Writing. This is a somewhat dated definition, but it's includes but is not limited to. And that is not limited to is really critical language. Handwriting, typewriting, printing, photostatting, photographing, and every means of recording. So this gives you a kind of sense of when this definition was written with the use of the term photostatting. But it also captures everything looking forward. And so it includes things like text messages, emails, all of that sort of stuff. And so everything kind of comes under that. If you have documents that are stored in a cloud somewhere, those count. And so it brings everything in with that language of is not limited to and every means of recording. A voicemail, since it's recorded on your phone, that's a public record. And I think it's one of those things you want to think through all of those sorts of things that capture that. State agency is every state officer, department, division, bureau, commission, board, or any committee of any state agency. So if it's part of the state in any form whatsoever, it falls under the public records law. Public official is any state, county, local, district, independent body, corporate and politic, governmental official or employee, whether elected, appointed, or hired. And so again, you see this kind of sweeping language that brings everyone within government under the umbrella of the public records law. And then we get down to a public record. And it's any writing containing information related to the conduct or administration of the public's business. Personal notes created by a public official for their own use unless shared with others. And so this allows you as an individual public official to write notes for yourself. But the minute I lean over and show those records, my notes, to the Secretary of State perhaps, because I wrote something funny that he'll find humorous, and we're going to have a little private chuckle, well, I may have just converted those notes into being a public record because they've been shared. Right? It's the same thing if I take notes and then I text them to one of my fellow committee members that wasn't at the meeting to say, hey, here's what we talked about. Those are no longer personal. There's something else that goes into this definition of public records law that's very important. Idaho, under the public records law, is what's known as a content-based state, meaning the content of the record determines whether or not it's a public record. There are states out there that have what is called a means-based test, meaning in order for it to be a public record, it has to have been created using public resources, whether it's a publicly issued computer or cell phone or telephone or whatever it is. Idaho is not a means-based state, so it doesn't depend on the use of public resources to create a public record. It's the content of the record. If the record contains the transaction of public business, and you fall under these definitions as a public agency, a public official, or any of those things, regardless of how that record is created, it is a public record. What that means is that if you send text messages on a personal cell phone, those are public records if they transact public business. If you have a third-party email account or a Snapchat account or TikTok, whatever it is, but it transacts public business, those are still public records. And I think that, one of the questions that when I was with the AG's office that came up routinely was folks using like a Yahoo or a Gmail or some third-party email account to say, oh, these aren't public records because I'm not creating them within the office environment or the public resourced environment. They're still public records if they transact public business. And the court has actually taken this very seriously. There was an example from eastern Idaho where two legislators met and they had a discussion. And part of the discussion was political party and campaign business. Part of the discussion was legislative business. They were in regular clothes. They weren't in suits. They were having lunch. They were in a restaurant. It was just the two of them far, far away from the Capitol in Boise. And the court said that those parts of the recording that were discussing legislative business, they were a public record. Now, the parts of the record that discussed campaign and that sort of business, party business, those were not a public record. And so you do have a dividing line in there. The question mark is always, where is the dividing line? And I'm not sure that we understand what that dividing line is specifically. A good example is if I were on my, let's go back in time, right? I was the Deputy Attorney General. I have children that need to be picked up, and I say, hey, I'm going to pick up the kids. I send it to my wife, and she says, oh, that's great. On your way home, can you grab a gallon of milk? Is that a public record? No, because it doesn't transact any public business. Now, if I were to send that same email, but I was like, man, this has been a bear of a day. I feel like I'm surrounded by idiots. Well, that might be a public record. And it's because there may be an argument there that you're transacting public business by assessing the quality of your day and who you're interacting with. And I think there's a nice cautionary element to that and the fact that records can be hybrid. It's also an important cautionary tale for those who respond to public records requests, because it's essential to note that there may be parts of public records that do have to be disclosed, and then other parts that are not matters of public record, or that they have an exemption. And again, the Idaho Supreme Court has weighed in on this point and said, you can't just exempt a whole file. You have to go through document by document to determine what parts of that document are exempt and what parts of that document are public records. Every person has a right to examine and take a copy of any public record in the state. It has to be conducted during regular office hours, and you can establish a copying fee schedule. Now, there are a few things that come out of this. Number one, you can make arrangements to go in and physically look at records. Under the law, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Is whoever the custodian of the record is, they also have an equal responsibility, equal to producing the record. It's equal to protecting the record. So they have a responsibility to protect the integrity of the record. And so if you come into an office and you say, hey, I want to look through these records because I'm not really sure what I'm looking for, and I want to take a copy of some but not all, you can do that. Recognize, however, that the governmental entity can put somebody in the room with you that you then have to pay for their time in order to protect the integrity of the record. And so that's part of the balance within this. You're entitled to the public records, but we also have a responsibility to protect the integrity of the record. And I will tell you that one of the things that we have dealt with over the years, at least when I was with the AG's office, is every now and then we'd have folks that would try to take a record. Like, they didn't want a copy, they just wanted to get that piece of the record and take it with them, right? We've had folks that tried to slip in something to a record. We had one case where folks, like, after the fact, generated records or tried to generate records. Metadata is not your friend. But I just want to let you know that, like, there's a reason for all of those elements within there. It's not to make it more difficult for you to get public records. And then the copying fee schedule. The copying fee schedule should be somewhere where you can say, okay, this is how much it is to get a copy of this record. In this day and age, copies should be more towards the 5 and 10 cent range, not in the $1.50 range. It's up to each government to establish their copying fee schedule, but it should be reasonable, and you should be able to verify it to say, look, this is how much it costs to make a copy. Another cautionary element out here. The public records law is different than some of the laws with regard to official documents. And so, for example, if you go to like a county assessor's office or something like that, and you want like a certified copy, the code has specific fees outlined for what those costs are. Those specific provisions control in this circumstance. And so you can't say I'm making a public records request for this information that's found under these code sections. That code section directs the fees and the process for how those records are gathered or collected. So as I said, it can't exceed the actual cost of the agency. It's at the lowest on the staff capable of handling. You can recover it for the labor costs with locating and copying the documents. The first 2 hours and 100 copies are free. And then you have, there are two things that are important here. You can aggregate requests, and so you can't come in and say, hey, I just want 20 records, 50 times, because that's a request for 1,000 records. And so the entity has the ability to aggregate those. And then you can also require advance payment. And so one of the things that you may get is the agency sends a response that says, we are prepared to comply with your public records request. We estimate that it will cost this much time, which should be itemized, meaning we anticipate this person working on it, this number of copies being generated by it, this amount of time to search and locate those records, and then here's what we need as advance payment. And we will provide you with the records or provide you with the ability to review the records upon receipt of this payment. And so advance payment can be required under the law. These fees should be itemized. So one of the things that we had come up every now and then within the AG's office is we'd have an entity that would say, you can have your public records, but we anticipate it'll cost us $5,000. And, you know, I go back to my attempts at math, and this is a show your work issue. And so if it does cost $5,000, show us how you got there. And I think that that's part of this process, is to identify how you get to whatever that dollar amount is. It's not just we don't feel like dealing with it, and so $5,000 will keep you at bay. The fees should not ever operate as a catch-all exemption, if that makes sense. So when we get a request, they're generally responded to within 3 working days in writing. You can take a longer amount of time as long as it is solely to locate or make the copies of the records. This isn't, the extra 10 days isn't to think about it. And one of the things that I always want to caution, particularly the government side of things, is if you need the 10 days, think very carefully, because if you're taking the 10 days to deny the request, why not just do it within the 3? Because think of the ill will that you're creating in saying, hey, we need more time to locate these records. And then when you come back and you say, we don't have any records, or they're exempt, that's going to create an issue. And so just understand that element. One of the things that is definitely at play nowadays is a lot of entities have what I call hybrid records, meaning depending on how far back in time you go for the records, there may be a collection of the records that they've got archived in a database, but then there's also a physical archive that they may have to go search. And so that may necessitate that 10 days. And it could actually be like an Indiana Jones type hunt where they're like, we don't know what's in the archive boxes. And so the answer justifiably is, look, we looked, but they're just not there. So that is an outcome. When you respond, you sort the exempt and non-exempt material. And again, it's because you may have stuff that is responsive but exempt. You hold on to the exempt material because if somebody wants to challenge your conclusion that that material is exempt, you want to be able to put that in front of the judge. And under the law, you're required to provide that information to the judge. You can inquire to narrow the request. And so if somebody is going to incur a fee, you can say, look, you've asked for a lot of records. Is there something more specific that you're looking for? And so I always think about this as the inquiry. You can ask the question, what? You cannot ask the question, why? So you can ask, what specifically are you looking for? I want to save you some money. You can't say, hey, why are you looking for this? Who are you trying to get? And so that's an important distinction under the law. If an agency fails to respond within 10 days, it's deemed denied. And that 10 days is important because it starts the clock running if someone wants to challenge the denial. On the government side, it's really important to respond to this because if you deny it without any response, well, you're kind of calling into question your good faith in responding to the public records request. And so in front of a court, you may have an uphill argument to say, hey, we are working in good faith to try to comply with the public records law. And the court saying, well, where's your response? It doesn't look like you followed any process here. And the process is clearly outlined by the statute. If it's denied, you're notified in writing. You have to indicate the specific exemption relied upon and then state the statutory reason for denial, which is the exemption that's identified in there. I think you, sir, brought a public records request in that's partially complied, partially responded to, and partially denied. One of the things that I looked for in that was that exemption, and it's there, right? Like that's actually a very well done response to a public records request. And then you have a right to appeal the denial, and that also has to be put in there, that you have a right to appeal it. It's within 180 days of the denial, which takes us back to that if you don't respond, the 180-day clock starts from the last date of that non-response. And so you have 180 days, and then you bring the action in the civil court where the records or some portion of the records are located. I'm not going to go through all of the exemptions because there's more than 100, and number one, it would take a long time. Number two, I recognize on the clock you don't need any reasons to want to take a nap at this point. But there's quite a few exemptions out there. I'm going to highlight a few that kind of come up over and over. There's some newer ones. First is this personal communications between legislators and personal identifying information of citizens. And so, for example, we have citizens that may reach out to legislators on their behalf to help them navigate like an agency issue. Think like, I don't know, Medicaid eligibility or something like that. There's parts of those records that should be protected because they involve like personal medical information or personal identifying like social security numbers. That sort of stuff is exempt under that exemption. And then you also see under 74-106, social security numbers and driver's license numbers are exempted. Again, you think about it in terms of if the goal of the public records law is to see how government is working, that sort of personal identifying information isn't part of that process unless you just know, well, they collect it, and that should suffice. If it's an exemption that's somewhere else in the code, in another spot in the code, that gets built into the Idaho Public Records Law. Same thing with federal law. If there's a specific federal law that exempts information, a great example of that is FERPA, the Federal Educational Right to Privacy Act. That gets built into the Idaho Public Records Law. Law enforcement and investigatory records. And there are specific elements of law enforcement and investigatory records. There are records that can be disclosed, and then there's a process by which you can claim exemptions, but you have to go through document by document within those law enforcement and investigatory records. And then there's a process after the investigation or the adjudication is complete, where they may now be public records. And so that they can become a little tricky because you've got pre-adjudication and then post-adjudication analyses that may come to different conclusions. Personnel records and professional discipline. I just want to put out there that if you are a public official, your salary is a public record. And actually, the controller has done a marvelous job of putting that out there for all of us to see. There are specific redactions for fish and game licenses, permits, and tags, and then residential street addresses for law enforcement officers. Trade secrets and production records. Again, trade secrets can be a little bit tricky because oftentimes a trade secret involves the government working with someone else that says, hey, this is our proprietary information. One of the practices that I often recommend to government is if you have trade secret information, have whoever you're working with identify what that is, because they're going to know it much better than we are if we're looking at it and trying to guess, is this proprietary? Is this a trade secret? Archaeological records, library records. I love the library record exemption. That exemption actually arises out of the confirmation hearings of Judge Bork. He was nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court many years ago. That nomination didn't go through. One of the things that came out in that nomination was a list of all of the videos that he had rented from his local video store. This is olden time stuff, back when we went to a store. Usually it was Friday night. You browse the racks looking for a video. There was a group of us that used to hang out at the return bin waiting for folks to bring the really good movies back. It was a crazy time, man. Just wonderful. But anyway, this list got put out there, and Congress actually said, wait a minute, what if folks start going out there and pulling out what books we've checked out and all of this other stuff? And so there was a national effort to prohibit the use of these library checkout lists. It didn't get through Congress. The FBI opposed it. And so what happened was, state by state, this was built into a lot of public records acts. And so just a little deeper history there for it. Draft legislation, but again, it's draft legislation only to a point. Once it gets printed or disclosed, then it's a public record. And then if the record is about you, you may have additional access to a record that is about you specifically, particularly if you want to review it for its accuracy. And there's a process under which it's called a name clearing process, where you can go through and say, wait a minute, that record is inaccurate. I want this to be corrected. If you are denied a public records request, the only remedy that you have, the only remedy, is to go to court. You go to court and you challenge the public records denial, and it can be a partial denial or a full denial. You go to court. There's no interim step. One of the things that you can try is to call the agency or entity's attorney and say, hey, I think you're overbroad with the application of this exemption. Can you rethink it? Can you reconsider it? Or is there a way that I can get this information that doesn't involve the exempt information? But for enforcement purposes, your only real remedy is to go to court. When you go to court, as I said before, you have to bring the material that you're claiming is exempt from disclosure with you, and you put it in front of the judge, who then reviews it along with the claimed exemptions and says either yay or nay. Yes, it's exempt, or no, you've gone too broad in the exemption, or maybe there's something in between where it's like you've claimed it here, but it doesn't really apply here, and they work through it document by document. I am aware of an instance in Idaho where there was a public records case and the government did not bring the records to court. That resulted in a very, very upset judge, because the law says I've got to review the documents. Where are the documents? So anyway, that was a tough day for that lawyer, as you can imagine. And then at the end of it, the court can say, hey, these records need to be disclosed. There is a bad faith penalty under the law. And so as I said before, if you don't respond and the record should have been provided, you can be required to pay a fine and attorney fees under the public records law. There is immunity. So for example, if you mistakenly release a record that should have been exempt, but you're doing so because you're trying to faithfully comply with the public records law, you're protected under the public records law in that instance. There is a prohibition on mailing lists. It's very thin. Essentially, if someone makes a public records request for names and addresses, you get to say, do you intend to use this as a mailing list? If they say no, it's a public record. You have to give it to them. If they say yes, you can say, well, you can't use it as a public mailing list, and so we're not going to, the law allows us to withhold it. With that, Betsy, Mr. Controller, Secretary of State, happy to answer any questions.
We have gotten a lot of good questions already submitted, and our two moderators, Secretary of State Phil McGrain and State Controller Brandon Wolf, will be posing the questions to Brian. And you can keep sending those questions in to idogquestions@gmail.com.
All right, thank you, Brian, for the presentation. This is a very specific one, but I think a great one to start off. When an invoice is presented for payment for responding to a voluminous public records request that requires over 2 hours of staff time, and that invoice is paid by the requester, what are the time guidelines for producing those records to the requester once an invoice has been paid and 10 business days have passed? I haven't seen this addressed in the Idaho Public Records Act. What would a judge consider to be a reasonable response in this instance when a great deal of time will be needed to respond to a voluminous public records request after an invoice has been paid?
So I'm gonna respond to, this wasn't specifically the question, but part of the question asked me to forecast what a judge would think. One of the first things you learn in law is you can never predict how a judge will think. But I think that, to me, if you say we need 10 days to get the record, you ask for advance payment and the payment is made, I think the expectation is that the records are ready to go, right? It should be a fairly quick turnaround at that point because all of the elements have been complied with. Now, the caveat I have there is depending on the voluminousness, if that's a word, the voluminousness of the request, it may be the sort of thing where the entity doesn't want to engage in the search or the compilation until payment is made. And we had an example of this in the AG's office. We had someone that requested over 12,000 documents from us. They were public. We said, this is what it will cost. Do you want us to proceed? They said, yes. We put all of the records together and gave them the bill for it. And they said, we just wanted to see if you'd comply. And so we were sitting on 12,000 documents that we had put labor hours and toner ink and everything else into. And I want you to know, like, that's your money. That's taxpayer dollars and resources going into that effort. And so I think there's a little bit of a lawyerly, it depends in the answer to that question.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Absolutely.
Just having been a custodian of a couple public records, there are situations, wouldn't you agree, where the payment is up front. So, I want 12,000 pages. You're saying, yeah, we've identified where the 12,000 pages are, but before we start gathering them, you need to pay X, Y, Z. It will take us however long to produce them.
Yeah, and I think, to me, when you're dealing with that large of a request, and this is kind of a government customer service pro tip at this point. If you've got a giant request like that, you probably want to have a couple discussions with whoever it is that's making the request to find out, is this genuine? Are they likely to pay it? And are we going to move forward? So then that gives you a little bit of time to kind of get your proverbial public record ducks in a row, so that you're not in a here's the payment and now you're compressed into that 10 days. It may be you've got some of it put together, or you're like, we've got it compiled, and so now all we have to do is hit print. I think there's some ways to kind of manage both the government side of this equation as well as the customer service side of the equation.
Sorry to add commentary. I think a good example of that comes up frequently, I'm certain you've dealt with this plenty of times, is there is that follow-up, the what versus why, right? And trying to narrow down. One of the best examples is people requesting emails. Mm-hmm. Because often the requests are very broad, or people think they know, and they're like, we want all the emails between the sheriff's office, the clerk's office, and the commissioners for the past 3 years. And it's like, you have no idea what you're actually getting into. And like all of a sudden that's, 300,000 records because of the size of the staffs of the various offices. And so I think there is that conversation that can happen between the custodian and the requester to try and say, we'll get you what you want, but let's help on both sides so you don't have to sift through it, and neither do we.
Absolutely.
There's a couple of questions that came in. I'm going to kind of lump a few of them together because they're similar in nature, talking about the retention schedules, like how long does a record, so I think some of it's from custodians asking, like, how long do I need to hold on to stuff? The other question was, is there anything that prohibits, so this was specifically asking about the legislator, but it could be any public official, from deleting a record prior to they recognize you can't, if you have a request, you can't then say, oops, I just deleted that after your request came in. But just any guidance on records retention and how long these records should be available.
Yeah. This is an important question because, again, it shows a distinction between the different statutes. Idaho does have records retention statutes that are very specific, and they require the classification of records into different categories, such as permanent, semi-permanent, and temporary. And then that applies across the board. And so if you, for example, go to the Idaho Department of Administration, you can find records retention schedules for many, many agencies that shows you, here are the type of records that we have, this is how we've classified them, this is how long we will keep them. The public records law, the only retention requirement under the public records law is you can't start deleting after you get the request, right? We're not Enron. And so to me, it's one of those things that these jokes are dated, I've realized. I've got to get some new examples. No video rentals, no Enron references. But to me, it's one of those things that you can't start deleting after you get the request. The question isn't then, is it a violation of the public records law? The question is it a violation of that separate records law and retention schedule that you're required by law to have? And that records retention schedule is a requirement at virtually every level of government in Idaho, meaning it doesn't just apply to the state, it applies to local municipalities. And so they should all have records retention schedules that you can look at and may also assist you in identifying what records are available. Emails, depending on their content, could be things that you can delete immediately, or they could be things that become permanent records and need to be archived through whatever your database and records retention system is. Again, it's a content-based inquiry.
And I guess just to clarify, because it comes up, you mentioned emails. Text messages, there really isn't anything addressing specifically text messages, right?
And I think, again, it comes down to the content of it and whether an entity has included them within their retention schedule. And I will leave it to attorneys much smarter than I to figure out whether and where text messages should fall into those retention schedules.
So, Brian, this is a good combination of last seminar and today's. Last one, for those who weren't, was the open meeting. But can a state agency approve in an open meeting a director finalist without naming the finalists? And the follow-up is, it's assumed they selected their top 3 in a closed meeting and approved in an open meeting their favorites without naming them.
So under the public records law, any group of finalists that is 5 or fewer are a matter of public record. And so if you have 5 finalists identified, that list of finalists has to be disclosed. And so if it's only 3, then that whole list should be disclosed at that point under the public records law, and it's contained in the personnel records exemption, that exemption from the exemption.
Okay, next question. And it's just an interesting one, that when elected officials, so it specifically says legislators, meet with other individuals out of state, so they travel and meet with other officials from another state, let's say other attorneys general, so to the Association of Attorney Generals, in a closed-door meeting, does a constituent have any ability to request or receive information about that meeting? So I presume they're talking about, potential legislation or something here in Idaho, so it's state business.
So your question actually brings up a really important element of the public records law. The public records law only applies to records that are in existence. It doesn't require government to create a record that is not in existence. And so within this example, if a public official travels out of state and has only in-person meetings with no notes and no agendas or documents like that, they aren't required to come back and create a report. So that's one part of that question. If they go out of state and they conduct public business in those meetings and there's an agenda or something and it relates to public business, well, that may be a public record, right? If no exemption applies, then that might have to be disclosed. If you go to a meeting and they give you a binder of, here's the biographies of all of our speakers and what they're going to talk about, that could potentially be a public record. And so, again, I hate to keep going back to this, but there's a little bit of it depends to this response. I think it's really important to understand, though, that government doesn't have a requirement to create public records to respond to the request. And so, for example, if we went to the controller and said, I want a list of every state employees that's Roman Catholic, well, he doesn't have that information, and so he wouldn't have to say, let me go out and poll all state employees and figure out where we're at on that. And so I think that's one of those things to always keep in mind, is that you may think, and this happens a lot, folks are like, government should have a record of this, and they just don't. It's not uncommon at all. Bless you.
Just to add, I think, to the travel, because you're right, the handouts might be, but the conversation or whatever happened, but because we see this is also there are records in terms of let's say an official's calendar may show, did they attend a meeting or also through Transparent Idaho, travel receipts or something, just to say someone did, but it, again, won't necessarily get the context of the meeting,
right.
Just
That's
the surrounding
right.
information.
Brian, this is a kind of long one, I'm going to try to narrow it down. And more specifically, it's access to records held by nonprofits with a contract with a state agency. So in this case, the Idaho Fish and Game and one of my favorite boards, the Wolf Board, has contracted annually with the Foundation for Wildlife Management to reimburse trappers and hunters. But the question is kind of dealing with trying to get reimbursement and records and such. Is there any way, the question is there any way to obtain these reimbursement records other than a court case? And if so, how would I do it?
So I think, I mean, to me, the question is, if the contract is for the private or nonprofit entity to perform government services, meaning tasks that are assigned by statute or otherwise to either of these two boards, whether it's Fish and Game or the Wolf Board, then the records related to the performance of that public business would fall under the public records law. Now, is there an exemption that then applies to that? I don't know. But any function, any government function performed by a nonprofit or a third party under that contract, those documents would fall under the public records law. And it's because the public records law has a prohibition on contracting out a government service to avoid application of the public records law. So you can't enter into a third party contract to avoid the public records law.
Easier question, I think. The 3 days or 10 days to grant or deny a public records request, does that time period restart when someone makes a modification to their request?
I mean, it depends. I mean, I don't know what the, I mean, if the modification is to get more records or completely different records from the first request, it may restart. If it's like a narrowing, like I wanted all of the emails from last month and really I just want them from last week, well, I don't know that you, I mean, you've already started down that path. And so it's answers you all hate, but it depends.
I think I will just add, the 3 days and 10 days are also just to ensure that some communication is happening between the requester and the custodian.
Yeah.
And often there may be back and forth that can go 30, 40 days, just depending on what the nature of the request is. But the most important part is that someone submits a request, they now have a statutory reasonable expectation to get some response. Even if it's not a response they want, they get some response as opposed to just being left hanging.
Yeah, and I think that's an important element is the give and take and the fact that the record's request never enters what I call a black hole phase, meaning it vanishes and there's no response from government for extended periods of time. And I can tell you as an attorney that has to stand in front of judges, that's the hardest spot to argue from. Like, your client has no response here. How do you explain that, counsel? And it's like, I don't know, ask them.
Well, and I think the alternative is sometimes, for the custodians who are listening, there are times it just doesn't go the way you planned or other events occur. And so as long as you're communicating that and saying, sorry, we weren't able to get this done in the time that we thought we originally were, here's our new expectations. A judge is also going to look at that. Like, as long as you are being open and honest with the requester, the big thing is having communication rather than the black hole.
Yeah. And you actually remind me of an instance that we had in the AG's office where we had archived documents, except we had archived documents through a system that we no longer had access to because of the upgrades to our system. And so it took us some time to figure out how to get back to the older system where it would be the equivalent of, I've got the records you want, but they're on a Betamax tape instead of a CD-ROM.
Brian, you touched on this a little bit, but I think it's a very simple, easy question, but I think it's an important one to elaborate on. Can a record request be verbal, or does it have to be in writing?
So the law allows for government entities to require the request to be in writing. And there's a number of very good reasons for it to be in writing. Number one, it creates a record of this is when you made the request, this is when we responded. We know there's no question about what the address is for the response to get mailed to or the email or whatever. Are very good reasons for requiring it in writing. That being said, sometimes there are requests that you can just take verbally and deal with it, right? If I've got somebody that comes into our office, for example, and said, hey, can I get the minutes from the last land board meeting? Well, yeah, here's a copy, right? Like, we don't need to create all of this process because it's handled just that quickly. That being said, not everything is like that. Like the bigger the request gets, the more likely it is that it does need to be in writing, more to protect your request, right? To make sure I don't forget something that you say, like I want this record and this record and this record. Well, it's very likely you'll get the first two, and then as you go further down the list, it gets a little dicier, and I might remember the last thing you asked for too. So there's a protective element to it. And I'm forgetful.
Okay, another question. It was, I think, briefly mentioned draft legislation not being a public record. The question, though, is specifically related to what about a draft city ordinance, city records? So when you talk about legislation, are you specifically talking about the legislature or?
Only the legislature. It only applies to the legislature.
Yep.
This one, is there a general cost estimate to appeal a denied public records request? And maybe some here in the audience have some numbers that they've experienced too.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, to me, again, it depends, right? Are you hiring an attorney? There's always a filing fee whenever you bring a civil action, which is what this would be, is a civil action to enforce the application of the public records law. But a lot of the cost is going to be driven by whether you hire an attorney, and then what attorney you hire changes the cost as well.
So for non-governmental devices, so this I think specifically like text messages, it doesn't say it, but it implies it. How do you verify that you're getting all the public records that are responsive to the request? Do some agencies require people to hand over their personal devices to an attorney to review, or is it just self-disclosure in terms of what requests or records are responsive?
So Idaho is what I call an honor system state. And so generally, the thought is that when you make a public records request, we diligently search and produce all of the records that are generated by that search, and that's the system that we have. Now, are there agencies that maybe take additional steps? Perhaps, but under the public records law, the requirement is just that you do a search.
Get one here for you.
I want to add that the best way to lose the honor system is for agencies to start getting caught and not producing all the records.
This is a good question. Some agencies seem to default to the 10-day extension request for records, even ones that are fairly narrow and quickly responded to by similar agencies. How would you recommend going about ensuring that they aren't using the 10 days to think about it and that they need to do it to find the records?
So I think that, to me, the way that you go about that is you kind of follow up and say, this is a really simple request. Why is it taking you 10 days? And ask the government to say why it takes 10 days, for example, to produce a month's worth of public meeting minutes. I think those are fair questions.
I'm going to summarize one of our longer ones that we've received, and it's an interesting one for you to address based on your, I guess, both current and private role. The question has to do with someone making a request for, in this case it was an audit report, but where the institution responded claiming attorney-client privilege. And one of the things in it, it says, there was no lawsuit or other legal proceeding going on at the time, so why would they be able to assert attorney-client privilege, and is there a way to challenge, somebody's exemption assertion?
So there's a couple things going on here. First of all, I'm going to assume that there is a public some sort of record underlying this claim of privilege, because this is a public records law, and so the claim would be, I want the document that is being protected under the attorney-client privilege. It is not a requirement of the attorney-client privilege that you have an active case. It could be advice to avoid a case. Like, don't say this in public or else you're going to get sued. That's attorney-client privileged protected information and maybe really good advice. The question is then you would bring an action like any other action saying the claimed exemption here is attorney-client privilege. They produce the document to a judge who reviews it and says, yep, this is attorney-client privileged information, or no, it isn't. So same procedure as anything else.
To follow up on that, Brian, I mean, is attorney-client privilege a reason to deny access to an entire public document like a government-produced audit report? That seems to me to go beyond the bounds of the exemption.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you have to go through document by document and identify what the privileged information would be. And, you know, there's also, I mean, under the law, there's requirements for attorney-client privileged information as far as attorneys. They have to mark it as such and identify it as such and treat it as such, right? And so there's a whole series of things that go into the attorney-client privilege. It just doesn't jump up out of the ground to protect folks. And at times, I think that folks may get a little fast and loose with that, like anything else, right? But to me, the way that you address that is you take the record to court and challenge it, challenge the claim.
I guess on that, I mean, only because I was tangentially near it, but, you know, in my prior employer, Ada County, we certainly had a case where the over-exercising of attorney-client privilege that went to court and kind of was the press club was involved with. I also think, just to echo one of the bit, there was a fault at the end of this question. So I don't think this is specific to the instance here. It says, how can any audit conducted by the state be exempt, you know, under attorney-client privilege? It's worth noting, too, under the Public Records Act, there are numerous, like, as you said, you didn't go through all the exemptions. There are, and so any type of record, you never know, there might be an exemption related to it. Now, that would be different than attorney-client privilege. I can give you a really good example. Security audits are routinely not, because you're finding vulnerabilities, like how do you break out of the jail? When the jail does an audit of their security, they don't share it with the inmates at the end.
Right.
And so there are some things that make, for good public policy reasons, we don't always share everything.
Right.
So if someone were to go in person to examine, and now that we have cell phones, could they use their phone and take a picture, or do they have to pay for and get a copy and pay that fee?
So there's an older case that someone tried to bring in their own copy machine to a clerk's office, and the court said, no, you can't bring in your own copy machine because the clerk has a duty to protect the integrity of the record. And so with you handling it and making copies yourself, that disrupts or potentially disrupts the integrity of the record, not to mention, suppose a sheet falls out and gets kicked under the copier or who knows what. That case, from my understanding, has not been revisited in the cell phone, iPad, scanner era, but I think a lot of it comes down to the clerk's evaluation of the protection of the integrity of the record. And so I guess that's a non-answer, or maybe our best bet is it depends answer.
One question, can someone request a criminal record from the county? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
But not all of it's disclosed.
Not all, it's all, yeah, that's exactly it. Like there's parts of it that are public and parts that are exempt.
Exempt, yeah.
This one, and I think is just clarifying here. It was stated contracts with suppliers, agencies, any entity getting state government funding. This sounds like if the entity gets funding, you get to see the public records and how the funding is spent. For example, universities, museums, nonprofits, hospitals, etc. Anyone who gets grants from government, is that a correct understanding?
No, it's only if you're performing a government function, if the contract is to perform a government function. If you're a private entity receiving a grant, well, then you fall under the rules of whatever that grant is. It's only, the Public Records Act only applies to the conduct of government business. It's means, it's not resource-based.
I think you addressed this, but I don't know if it was a specific enough. So the question was, an agency has a lot of data. If a request comes in that would require analysis of that data, so are they required to provide the analysis of the data? And this kind of getting past just records, talking about data.
Not again, this goes back to our, you don't have to create a record that doesn't already exist. And so if the analysis hasn't already been done, you can't make a request that the government do the analysis.
Well, I think that's all of them.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. Thank you all very much. I hope it was helpful.
We went a little longer than planned because we had so many good questions, and I'd say it was well worth it. Great answers. Thank you so much, Brian. And I really enjoyed the conversation between our two elected officials here and Brian about the nuances of this law. Let's thank them all again. The mention was made that the sole remedy when you're denied a public record, even if you're denied wrongfully, is to go to court. And I think that's probably the biggest flaw in our Idaho Public Records Act. And it would be great if we had an intermediate level of appeal, short of having to hire a lawyer and go to court. This is something IDOG and many others in the state have been pushing for a long time, and we will continue to do so until we get it. Many states do have that. One really great thing about our Public Records Act, though, is those time frames. Those 3 and 10 days guarantee you a prompt and timely response, and that's how the law is supposed to work, and I think that's great. I would like to thank all of our partners today and refer you to our website, openidaho.org, for the full recording, the slides, and additional information about all of our open government activities, and also some timely posts of stories about things that are going on regarding public records and meetings around our state, and more information about IDOG. All of you who registered for this session today will be receiving an evaluation survey by email. Please fill it out. Let us know what we can do better, what you liked, what worked. It'll help us improve things as we go on into the future. And thank you all once again for participating.